Welcome to all American people. We're here at Coastal Ale House, and we've got the host, Greg Everett, but he's sitting on the other side.
Absolutely.
Final day of featuring one of my favorite people.
Yes.
Before we do that, once again, we're taking a hiatus for a while.
Right.
Tell everybody once again about your son.
We're dying to get back, and of course, we're particularly excited to get back so James can watch us on TV. Our son, James Holmes, Everett, Melissa, and my son, just born here at Conway Medical Center on May 19th. Thank you to all the great folks at Conway Medical Center. They did a tremendous job, and we are thrilled to bring him into the world. Emma Claire now has a younger brother, not just baby dolls to play with.
Yeah, it's great, and we're so excited for you, but we're really excited about what has happened this week. We've had the opportunity to feature your dad, some past interviews from 2007, 2008. This is going to be the last one we did in 2008 from Garden City Furniture.
Right.
And he was such an interesting person, and it's probably unfair for me to do this and put you on the spot, but we've got a minute and a half here. Tell me about your dad. That somebody that wouldn't be. We got a minute. Tell me in 1 minute about your dad.
That is unfair, Donald, because you cannot describe Dad, his life and his love of Durham, North Carolina, his celebration of Durham in every way possible, and particularly Duke, the university, the law school, the medical school, everything about it that he loved. He was Mr. Durham, Mr. Duke, and he loved his family more than anything.
And one thing that I could tell from him, and expand on this, like maybe we have 30 seconds, but he loved his students. It was remarkable.
Yes. Every one of his students was a member of his family, and he extended his home. My mother and he opened the home up. All three of his sons were raised with his students together, and he loved his students like children.
Well, let's toss to it now.
Absolutely. Here is my father, Robinson Oscar Everett, from August 8, 2008, the last chance I had to interview him. Emma Claire and James's grandfather. Here he is.
Good morning. Welcome to Carolina People. This morning we're at Garden City Furniture at 2444 Highway 17 Business South in Garden City. We're focused on part 2 of the Honorable Robinson Oscar Everett. Good morning again, Dad. Glad to have you back.
Great to be back.
It's thrilling to have you yesterday. All week, we kicked off the week with Dr. Charles Sasser, the medical director for Mercy Hospice and Palliative Care. And on Tuesday and Wednesday, Flo Vinson, who you had met recently in a North Carolina bar event, who happens to be the president of the South Carolina bar, was with us. And on Wednesday, after her interview, she was headed up to New York for the American Bar Association meeting. Very exciting time. And, of course, the opportunity to get you in, having 2 lawyers this week, both from families of lawyers. Flo herself practiced is from a family where 3 of her older brothers are lawyers. Of course, you, having practiced with your mother and father, and soon to practice with your son and daughter-in-law. And
hopefully.
That's right. And of course, they just took the bar last Tuesday and Wednesday, I believe.
They've taken it and are waiting for results.
I know, which we're all excited about. As you had mentioned, Mother, Dad, and me was the Everett, and Everett at one time. Now it'll be you, Luke, and Sherry, Everett, and Everett in action again.
I'm looking forward to it.
And y'all's law office is there in Durham.
In Durham, right out on Irwin Road near Duke University.
It's housed in Irwin Terrace, I believe.
That's right. Wonderful landlord.
You got a good landlord, don't you?
Yeah.
Is he or she pretty hard on the rent?
I tell you, he and she are doing pretty well by us.
Yeah, that is great. That is great. And of course, you've also got Luke and Sherry, who will be joining the firm hopefully in a couple of months, have a wine bar there, 6 Plates Wine Bar, which is housed there virtually right below your office,
That's
2
right.
floors down.
That's right.
Which
We
is
drop
great.
in on it very easily.
Yeah, a little after work pop in there. So much of yesterday of what we talked about, obviously, Dad, you were growing up in Durham and then attending Harvard Law School, returning to Durham to teach there at Duke Law School, but more importantly to practice with your parents. And of course, then you left for a while, came back to Durham, and I think we left the picture yesterday in the mid-50s, which is about the time. As you think back to the early years of practicing there with your parents, were there some things that going on there that really stand out in your mind, something that your father may have inspired you to really stick it out?
Well, there are 2 or 3 things that I remember particularly. One, of course, is not directly related to law, but indirectly, and that is that both mother and father were interested in public service. And my mother was one of the first 2 women to serve on the city council of the city of Durham.
Right.
And my father in the 20s and early 30s, as I recall, had been a legislator in the state legislature in Raleigh, and had served 5 terms over there and had rendered public service. And by the same token, in the law practice, they tried to help people, and they were less interested in the fees than in helping the client, and they would really put themselves out. My father set an example for me by taking cases that a lot of other people wouldn't take because they were, you know, unpopular. He would represent murderers if he thought they were innocent, or even if he thought they were guilty, if he could help them get as light a sentence as possible. He felt everybody deserved good representation. My mother told me at a later time about how when I was a small baby, she got a call from the Associated Press, and they said, "Has Mr. Everett gotten home yet?" It was the end of the day. She said, "No. Why are you calling?" They said, "Well, the last time we heard anything about him, people were shooting at him."
Oh, God.
And he had gone to a neighboring community to assist 2 African-American lawyers from Durham who were representing a young black man accused of raping a white woman, which was obviously a very, very unpopular type case back in the late 20s, early 30s.
Boy, I bet.
And apparently at the end of the day, the court had recessed, and father and his 2 colleagues walked out to the automobile. He had driven them up, and there was a mob there. They didn't know what was going to happen, and he told them to jump in the back of the car, get down to the bottom, and he took off for Durham. And apparently at that point there was noise of gunfire. Somebody said backfire from the engine, who knows. But I remember he told me that they got back to Durham. The other lawyers did not want to go back the next day. I mean, they felt there was a lot of risk. And he in turn said, "You got to go back. We have to go back.
Right.
We cannot be frightened out of performing duty for our clients."
Right.
And so they went. And I think they lost the case. I don't know what happened, but at least they provided the representation that the defendant was entitled to. Father had another interesting case who went to the North Carolina Supreme Court. He had mentioned it to me, and I, at a later time, read the opinion. But there was a Jewish shopkeeper in Durham, and this is about the beginning of the 1920s, and he went in to pay his water bill, and he had it all in pennies, several hundred pennies, and the guy at the counter, the clerk, was very unhappy, knocked the pile of pennies over, made some very insulting remarks, which were anti-Semitic. And ultimately, my father represented this man in suing the city of Durham because a public official should not engage in that type of conduct.
Right.
And the case went up to the North Carolina Supreme Court, where Chief Justice Walter Clark wrote a famous opinion basically saying, how can you tolerate this sort of conduct? You have to uphold the rights of the person who is a citizen, who is part of one of the oldest cultures in the world, a culture from which we've inherited many, many things, and we're not going to allow this to be done. And so the father's client obtained a verdict against the city of Durham and established a point. And that particular opinion during the 20s was cited quite a bit, I understand, because it was a judicial criticism of anti-Semitism.
Right, right.
So father represented a lot of people who were not highly regarded by some portions of society, but who he thought deserved good representation and who he thought deserved support.
You think that representation impacted you, caused you to really stick it out or take on some cases that may not have been popular or may not have been, you may have been considered quixotic or Don Quixote?
Well, I can think of one instance back during the 90s, after I'd finished my term as Chief Judge of the Court of Military Appeals. And right after my mother died, I got involved with a friend, a lady whom I had represented before in connection with an accident in which her husband was killed and she was badly injured. In any event, she and I initiated a lawsuit together with you. You were
I was one of the 5 plaintiffs, that's right.
A secretary we had, and a colleague of mine from Duke Law School. The 5 of us initiated a lawsuit which many people thought had the chance of the proverbial snowball you know where.
Right.
And we sued Attorney General Janet Reno, the governor of North Carolina, everybody in sight, because in 1990, the North Carolina legislature had adopted a system of, a plan for congressional redistricting, which appeared to us to have been drawn with a racial motive. It was sort of like a quota system built in, and sometimes described as a racial gerrymander. And the basic idea was to assure that a congressman, an African-American congressman, would be elected from a district in northeastern North Carolina, and another would be elected from a district which was like a thread running from Durham down to Charlotte and Gastonia.
Right.
And our view was this just isn't right.
Right.
Well, we got a lot of flack, and I'd always had good ties with the African American community, but many members of that community thought that it was very inappropriate for me to be attacking a racial gerrymander. Well, we went up to the Supreme Court on that 4 different times, and with differing results, but we established some important principles. And I felt that was the sort of thing that my dad would have wanted me to do if he had still been alive, or my mother, because they believed in principle. And it wasn't, you didn't practice law to make money. You wanted to make a little money, you want to support yourself and your family. But you wanted to assure that the system of justice ran efficiently and fairly. One of the things I was happy about when I was Chief Judge of the Court of Military Appeals, and even earlier, was that I had a part in trying to improve and enhance the military justice system, because service members deserve the best. And back in the early 50s, I had been a counsel working with Senator Sam Ervin, famous senator from North Carolina, in trying to modify and upgrade the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
I remember reading about that, yeah.
In 1968, our efforts resulted in some important improvements. For example, authorizing military judges for the first time, trying to give them status. So I was able to work in that capacity, and then I chaired a committee for the American Bar, which worked in the area of military justice. This was in the late 70s. And then in turn, on the Court of Military Appeals, as it was then called, I was able to help achieve, I think, a movement forward in military justice, which in some ways makes it the fairest system we have.
Really? And how would that be?
Well, in terms of right to counsel, for example, right to counsel, counselor provided service members, be they an E1, a buck private, or a 4-star general, they get free counsel, trained military counsel. There are privileges against self-incrimination, which have been expanded into warning requirements. In military justice, there is a review of the appropriateness of the sentence. If it's a serious case, a review designed to assure not only the sentence is lawful, but that it is appropriate for the particular facts. So it is a more detailed review, a more careful, counsel provided automatically at all levels of the military justice system. It's a system that has, I think, in many ways been become distinctive. And you know, it's unfortunate they didn't use that system in connection with trying the detainees and the terrorists. I think that might have worked better than the use of the military commissions.
Right, right. Well, the great thing was back in 1980, a lot of folks knew of your interest there in military servicemen and women, and your interest in making sure they got a fair shake. And clearly, the 14-person committee that was selected to appoint or to help decide who would be the next judge and subsequently the chief judge of the Court of Military Appeals, the selection committee voted unanimously, 14-0, because they recognized your interest in the affairs or the rights of service members. It was fascinating reading about that. Just a little quote from something in March of '99. You, had served as an Air Force JAG, and he deals very successfully with the Judge Advocates General, even though he often takes positions contrary to theirs. Indeed, he enjoyed the enthusiastic endorsement of all of the service JAGs who were eager to see a nominee with a broad knowledge of military justice. And it showed well in joining the bench and having that tremendous support from the selection committee, what Jonathan Lurie, later the court historian and someone who was a member of that committee, wrote in as a love-in for the 14-person selection committee, which was very special. So clearly your love and following them and supporting them throughout is evident even to this day. This award that you received back in 1999 is now named after you from the Judge Advocates Association on an annual basis.
And I have the privilege of awarding it to others.
Which is great to be there, which is great to be there every year. And it's special to think about that because clearly that helped prompt your forming the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security back in 1993 there at Duke Law School. Share with viewers a little about the center. Of course, its tremendous executive director, Colonel Scott Silliman, and what prompted you to create the center there at Duke Law School?
Well, while I was serving as chief judge, I continued to do some teaching at Duke and taught a seminar on national security law, some of the issues that were being encountered during the 80s and were anticipated for the 90s. And at some point, it occurred to me that it would be appropriate to create a center at Duke Law School to focus on issues of national security. Now, there was one prior center which had been organized at the University of Virginia, and ironically, the person who organized it was a former student of mine.
Another Duke Law grad, yeah.
That's right. And he had done a very good job with it. And so I thought there's plenty of room in this field and we ought to get rolling, and we did. With the help of funding from my mother's estate,
right.
We established the center at Duke. The acronym is LENS, Law, Ethics, and National Security. We brought in Scott Silliman, who had been a very highly regarded colonel in Air Force JAG.
Right.
We didn't know at that time that 9/11 would take place, that terrorism and things of that type would become a major concern. We didn't know there would be problems in Iraq. We didn't know about problems that would take place in the future concerning surveillance. All sorts of very interesting issues. Mm-hmm. And we've been able to have conferences, provide courses, cooperate with other groups, and I think have had sort of a model in terms of work that's important. I have in mind another center or similar activity in a somewhat different area I'm working on now. I don't know what will come of it. But that's in the area of the correctional system and prison and alternatives.
Right.
The United States has a tremendous, a remarkably high percentage of its population who have either are in jail or have been in jail. Mm-hmm. And this problem of confinement and then rehabilitation and reentry is something that's interested me for a long, long time.
The reentry project, one in particular that you've been working on with, who are a couple of the other folks that are helping?
Well, there are several people I've been working on with, and I'll mention in a moment. Let me just give you sort of a history.
Sure.
Back in 1952, when I was on active duty as an Air Force JAG, the Air Force decided, not so much for humanitarian reasons, but for economic reasons, that it would be important to salvage airmen who got in trouble, who were tried by court-martial. They get jail sentences, and they were going to be thrown out with a dishonorable discharge. But the Air Force thought, let's try to retrain these people, reorient them, give them a new sense of purpose.
Right.
We've got a big investment. Some of these people have been trained in a very expensive manner, and they need to be salvaged.
Sure.
So they created a center, a group, at the base where I was stationed, and I watched it expand, and it turned into a very successful activity. And so over the years, I've thought about what are the ways in which people can be salvaged. In what way can we make it easier when a prisoner gets out of jail to get a job and to resume activities in the community and be a really productive member of society? Well, about 4 or 5 years ago, one of my former students was in touch with me. He'd been a very prominent lawyer in Western North Carolina, but unfortunately he also had become a white-collar criminal. He had taken some money from client accounts.
Right.
Wound up in federal prison out at Butner for 5 years, several years, 4 or 5 years. And I had contact with him and brought him in to talk to my students after he was released, to talk to them about what happens in prison when seen from the standpoint of a person who's had a long legal background and training and experience. And he in turn introduced me to some of the prison officials, including case managers and the warden out there. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we created a project at Duke, at the law school, to look into this whole field of sentencing. And I, last fall, that is the fall of 2007, I initiated a seminar on sentencing and punishment. And we looked into topics like probation, alternatives to confinement, problems that arise in reentry. I've been involved in efforts to create a nonprofit foundation that will work in this field. I've been involved, at least in the periphery, in some programs for training judges and prison officials on reentry and getting people out of prison back into the community. And this is really turning into a very gripping activity for me, something I'm really finding worthwhile. I discovered that the wife of one of my former students, who was up in Virginia, has created a very worthwhile project called Boaz and Ruth to take prisoners from the Virginia prisons and reestablish them. In so doing, they have rehabilitated a dilapidated, decaying area of Richmond. So things of this sort are going on, and I want to devote more attention to it and get my students and others interested.
Students there at Duke Law School. That's great.
As well as students at some of the neighboring institutions.
Sure, at North Carolina Central and at UNC Chapel Hill. That's great. That's great.
So I think there's a role to be played in that regard.
There's so many great topics, Dad, and all of them essentially come back. Everything you're sharing comes back to you and really your heart of gold and your ability to reach out on behalf of others, folks that are down or folks that may or may not have been getting proper treatment. We think about service members prior to 1968, maybe not always getting a fair shake, and wanting to make sure that you really worked hard for many years, back from Sam Ervin all the way to that time, and then later representing their interests as a fair and impartial interpreter there.
Well, another area I've tried to help in is veterans and giving them rights, because we got a lot of veterans now. They got a lot of problems. So the ways in which those can be worked on.
Absolutely. It was a great quote here from that same piece back in 1999, highlighting about both all of your students as well as the servicemen and women. I've got to read that, or as devoted to him as he is to them. One of his former clerks stated that he always knows his students, at least by their face. Almost every place he goes, he sees a former student. He has an encyclopedic memory. But another great one, on visits to our military sites, he has a habit of writing a note to everyone he sees, from the commanding generals to the lowest ranking, to come visit him, his court, to visit the Court of Military Appeals. One day an E4 arrived unannounced. Judge Everett was delighted and remembered she'd been one of his drivers. He made her queen for the day, gave her a personal tour, and took her to lunch. You think about those days on the court and the ability to help out both in the courtroom and guiding attorneys of both sides to benefit their clients, but also serving as impartial as possible. No surprise, one court clerk said, he is very busy, but he loves people. He knows no station in life. He's always very inquisitive. Whoever you are, you have something he wants to know about. And that's part of the reason we've had you here yesterday morning and this morning, and we've run out of time. Again, just like last summer, we sure hope we can get you back another time. And thanks again for coming in to be with us today.
Thanks for the privilege of being with you, Greg.
Absolutely. It's been a real treat. Stay tuned to more Carolina People. The Honorable Robinson Oscar Everett coming up next. You know, a great Palmetto State native and a former circuit court judge in South Carolina, and one of Dad's successors there on the Court of Military Appeals, Judge Walter Cox, said it better than anyone. I was once going to write a bio about him, but I found it too daunting a task. We've done over the last 2.5 hours, an hour and a half last summer and an hour today. We've made a stab at it. Still haven't got there. If you want to learn more about him, and I think if you've sat here the last 2 days, you'll want to, get online to carolinapeople.com. Check out some of the interviews from last summer. Hear about Dad and another student there at Harvard in an eating competition with the Yale football coach. Hear about his adventure, actually his night in jail, on carolinapeople.com from last summer. It's a great treat, and I hope you enjoyed the last 2 days as much as we have. Dad, thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Being with us
Great
this morning.
to be with you.
Absolutely, yes.